darkness we were waiting, without hope, without light, till from heaven you came running. There was mercy in your eyes, to fulfill the law and prophets. To a virgin came the word, from a throne of endless glory, to a cradle in the dirt. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of Kings. To reveal the kingdom coming, and to reconcile the lost, to redeem the whole creation. You did not despise the cross, for even in your suffering, you fell to the other side. Knowing this was our salvation, Jesus for our sake you died. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of In the morning that you rose, all of heaven held its breath, till the stone was moved for good. Though the Lamb had conquered death, and the dead rose from their tombs, and the angels stood in awe. For the souls of all who come to the Father are restored, and the church of Christ was
Once again, we take a look at one of the passages we won't be covering in this Sunday's sermon. And this one is 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 17 to verse 23. And the title of this epistle is, of course, 1 Peter. It comes from the Apostle Peter. And just a little bit of a window into who he is afforded to us by a poem written by Arthur Pitcher, one of our previous territorial leaders for the Salvation Army for Canada and Bermuda. This is called My Boat and Me, and it's from Memoirs of Peter, a wonderful book, if you can find a copy. The years now held in gracious memory, and any time which still is mine by grace, have been and shall be dedicated to pay installments on a still recurring debt. Simon was my name, a man of sand was I, and how the fire of love and trust, the pressure of infinite love and grace, could take my shifting, windswept character and change it into stone, was more than I could see. Yet in those first dear days by Galilee, his love perceived the promise, and prophetically envisioned e'en for me that, after sandy shiftless days had passed, I would become Peter, and would stand at last strong enough to form a vital part of the kingdom he was building for the human heart. First he took my ship, my unpretentious boat, and when the crowd had pressed him to the sea, he stood upon its moving deck and made of my poor little bark a pulpit from which wondrous tales he told. A sower casting seed, the kingdom seed, and little birds and thorn and scorching sun, undoing what the sower faithfully had done. But harvest came, and 30, 60, 100-fold, the seed receiving in willing hearts brought forth. And as his voice against the murmuring sea rose up on the wave and fell, it seemed to me 'twas all a miracle. My boat could never be as always it had been, for he transformed it somehow on that day. And when the crowd had all dispersed that night, and Jesus took his path into the hills to be alone to pray, I sat and thought and wished, oh, how I wished, that just as he had changed by using it, my boat, to something it had never been before, so I might by grace be made worthy of Peter, that new name which now I bore. I look across the years, remembering now what trouble, what despair I must have brought to his dear heart before what he had sought could come to pass in me. I loved him, but I saw in him a king. How could I know redemption he would bring by hanging on a tree? Forbid it, Lord, it shall not be to thee. And sorrowfully the sand was still in me. It chafed his tender spirit, but he saw that fires were burning that would weld the sand to stone. How hot those fires! Gethsemane, the judgment hall. Fain would I forget, but he forgave, and day by day, e'en yet, though many years have gone since Galilee, it seems the grains of sand still fall away. But by his power at breaking of the day, this fisherman, transformed by grace, will be, and I will be the rock he saw in me. So Peter, writing his epistles, knowing the work of transformation that had been wrought in his soul, taking something as changing as sand into creating something best described as stone. And you see something of that in these epistles of Peter. What's permanent, what lasts, what endures. Listen to some of these words. First of all, in verse 18. You know that from your empty way of life inherited from your ancestors, you were ransomed, not by perishable things like silver or gold, but by precious blood like that of an unblemished and spotless lamb, namely Christ. Who could figure that gold and silver would be deemed perishable, but something organic like blood would be imperishable? But that's the good news of the gospel. The blood of Christ never loses its power. And then towards the end of this chapter, Peter writes, "For all flesh is like grass, and all its glory like the flower of the grass. The grass withers and the flower falls off, but the word of the Lord endures forever." Friends, we have something enduring in our lives. We have something permanent, which is the blood of Jesus Christ. And even though our world changes, and even though we change a fair bit, at the core of our being, through our relationship with Jesus, we can be made, like Peter was, into rock, into something solid because of the permanence of the blood of Jesus Christ.
Turn your eyes on Jesus. Look full in His wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of His glory and grace. Turn your eyes on Jesus. Look full in His wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely